You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Nordstrom. Summer's almost out and fall's calling. Luckily, Nordstrom has everything you need for the season ahead, all under $100. Discover new arrivals from your favorite brands like Mango, Princess Polly, Wave, Free People, BDG, and more. Whether you're planning a last-minute getaway, heading back to class, or refreshing your office looks, you'll find the latest trends and beauty must-haves without breaking your budget. It's easy, too, with free shipping, free returns, and in-store order pickup. Shop today, in stores, and at Nordstrom.com.
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 227, The Battle of Britain Part 2, The Hardest Days. This week, a big thank you goes out to Jake, Jennifer, Eric, T, Bill, Obertix, I think, for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The first day of the Luftwaffe's Great Offensive, Adler Tag or Eagle Day, had occurred on August 13th, and overall it was a bit disappointing. Poor weather during the early morning had caused confusion and some delays, which meant that there were fewer overall sorties than were otherwise planned. But there were some encouraging reports from those sorties that did manage to make their way to their targets throughout the day. The biggest top-line item was that the Germans believed that 1/4 of all British fighters were already destroyed, a number arrived at by the mistaken estimates of total RAF fighter strength, combined with the very optimistic estimates made of the fighters destroyed on the first day. It seemed, to the Luftwaffe leaders anyway, that they were making serious progress to their goal, and that they were on the path to victory within the expected time frame, which was to eliminate fighter command as an effective force in less than a week. This episode will cover the days following Eagle Day, during which the German plan called for the final destruction of fighter command, so that over the following weeks, the Luftwaffe's efforts could be shifted to other missions that were also an essential part of invasion preparations. It was not going to be easy, though, because when operations had ended on August 13th, there were serious concerns among Luftwaffe leaders that the poor weather that they had experienced during August 13th would continue into the 14th, hampering another day's worth of operations. However, this would not end up being the case, and in fact, by mid-morning, the conditions for flying were very good. Weather forecasting during this period is interesting, and it will be something that we will continue to discuss during these episodes and throughout the rest of the podcast, due to its importance to the air campaign, as well as the fact that during this period of history, they did have a pretty good understanding about how weather worked, but it was still very challenging to predict what would happen in the future, particularly around weather that was moving off of an ocean like the Atlantic Ocean, where they had just simply less information about what was happening. Unlike today, they didn't possess an infinite amount of data about what was happening everywhere in the world, and so they had to do the best that they could with the information that they had to try and understand what would happen over the next day and over the next week. On the 14th, things would actually work out though, and in the morning, target lists were sent out, and they were very heavy on British airfields once again, with the goal to hit a large number of airfields and damage them, hopefully putting them out of action entirely. From just the 2nd Flying Corps, Stukas would be sent against Hawkinge and Limpney, while Doniers would target Eastchurch and Rochester. Changes had also been made to how the German bombers were to be escorted to their targets, with a greater emphasis placed specifically on providing fighter cover for the slower and more vulnerable Stukas. This would come into play when Stukas were flying towards Hawkinge and Limpney. Above the Stuka formations were positioned Bf-109s. They were presented with the perfect opportunity to dive down on some Spitfires of 54 Squadron as they attempted to attack the German dive bombers. Having the altitude advantage was critical to fighters of both sides because it allowed them to have greater speed and energy in the attacks. They could then use that speed advantage to position themselves in the proper place to make attack runs on the enemy. In this case, the Spitfires were caught partially by surprise and had to break off their attacks on the slower German bombers to react to the 109s that were suddenly closing in. The distraction allowed the Stukas to make their bombing runs without much interference, and also gave them cover as they began to head back to their home bases, which was critical for the slower German dive bomber. During the afternoon of the 14th, there would be a succession of raids that would take place. Both of the Luftwaffe would be in action, with Luftwaffe 2 launching raids on 8 different airfields, while Luftwaffe 3 sent out 9 raids. This had the effect of spreading out the British response, making it difficult to concentrate enough fighters on any specific raid to be effective at driving it off. When the British fighters were able to attack, though, they did often have the intended effect of disrupting the German bombers, preventing them from having a nice, easy flight to their targets. Another challenge that the German bombers would always have was finding the correct targets for their bombs. This was a time before extremely accurate GPS, and so there was quite a bit of skill and luck involved in arriving over the proper target, which became even more difficult when faced with an enemy's fighters. For one set of German bombers who were supposed to be targeting the major fighter command airfield at Biggin Hill, the evening haze that they would encounter during their flight would cause them to get off course, and instead of hitting Biggin, they instead would drop their bombs over a satellite airfield at West Malling. Now, that was a valid target, it was an airfield, but even if they put it completely out of action, it would not have even close to the effect of an attack on Biggin Hill. While the 14th had seen several raids against British airfields and other targets, it was not close to what had been hoped due to the continued spotty weather. The expectations were that the weather would remain mostly the same the next day on the 15th, with continued cloud cover making further operations difficult. To try and make the best out of yet another delay, the decision was made for the Luftwaffe leaders to make their way back to Germany to discuss the events of Eagle Day and their plan moving forward. While several different topics would be discussed at this meeting, the most important for the overall course of the campaign was that the German bomber losses were seen by Goering as far above what was sustainable. This was particularly true of the Stuka squadrons, which had been hit hard on the 13th during their raids over Britain. In an effort to protect them, he would order that the fighter protection for any Stuka raids be drastically increased. For RAF Fighter Command, this focus of the Luftwaffe on bomber escort missions was a good and a bad thing at the same time. From the very beginning of the campaign, the RAF had focused on maximum attrition on German bombers, with British fighters generally just trying to distract German escorts while others moved in to attack the more vulnerable German bombers. This served the purpose of reducing the total bombing capacity of the RAF, which was good, but also pulled the fighters in closer and closer to the bombers, which reduced their effectiveness, which was also good. However, it would also mean that there would be more British fighters lost in these attacks on the bombers simply because there were more Bf-109s and Bf-110s there to escort them. But it also made those Bf-109s less effective because they weren't positioned optimally to react to fighters. So again, it was kind of a push-pull situation. Along with his thoughts on bomber escort, Goering also wanted a more narrow target focus on the RAF, dispensing with the raids that had continued to be done on naval targets. This might have been a good decision when it came to trying to achieve the goal of neutralizing the RAF, but it did come at a cost of overall invasion preparations. In retrospect, the funniest part of the meetings that occurred on the 15th is that they would not have happened if the weather had been better on the days before, and they also would not have happened without the incorrect weather predictions for the 15th. Because instead of continued bad weather on the 15th that would hamper air operations, the weather was actually great. This meant that instead of being a slow day while the bosses were away talking about the future, it would instead be one of the most active days of the campaign. One raid would see groups of Stukas, once again with heavy fighter escort, attacking the same airfields as they had the day before, Hockinge and Lympne. They would make it to the airfields, and in a case of really bad luck for the British, 4 of the bombs would miss the airfield entirely. But instead, it would land near a road on the outside of the airfield, and it would have a tremendous impact when they just so happened to cut the power lines to 3 chain home stations at Rye, Forness, and Dover. It's funny how luck works sometimes. Those bombs that were dropped by accident and missed their target completely had a greater impact, at least temporarily, on British radar coverage than any of the dedicated attacks on the radar stations from the previous days. This was very helpful when the largest raid by Luftwaffe 2 on the 15th was a raid of 88 Dornier 17s, which would target 2 aircraft factories. This raid would be escorted by 130 Bf-109s, which would heavily outnumber the possible British response. When the raid was detected by the chain home stations, 24 Hurricanes and 12 Spitfires that were already airborne were sent against it, while another 4 squadrons were scrambled to also join in the fighting. They would be largely unsuccessful in pushing through the fighter screens, and the German bombers would make their way to their targets, dropping about 300 bombs on the factories. Large quantities of parts and components were destroyed, which would impact the availability of the short Stirling heavy bombers for several months. Construction would essentially just be completely delayed. There would be multiple other raids throughout the day, with the goal of trying to take advantage of the actions of other raids that were pulling British fighters one way and then another. All of this resulted in damage to 3 airfields to the point where they were out of action for several days, while 4 others were damaged.
This episode is brought to you by the world's first reposado from Tequila Herradura. Made with slow-cooked, hand-harvested agave sealed into oak barrels and aged 11 months. Before being enjoyed in your glass. Experience the world's first reposado. Tequila Herradura. Please drink responsibly. Responsibility.org. Tequila Herradura. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Brown-Forman, Louisville, Kentucky. Herradura is a registered trademark. Copyright 2025 Brown-Forman Corporation.
Make your next vacation unforgettable on Royal Caribbean's newest ship, Star of the Seas. It's everything you've loved about every family vacation you've ever been on, with mind-blowing thrills at the largest water park at sea, 7 onboard pools for every level of chill, more than 40 ways to dine and drink, and even more to enjoy at our award-winning private island, Perfect Day at Coco Cay. This is the new Star of the Seas. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
While the majority of the action would always be in the south due to the raids from Luftwaffe 2 and 3, on August 15th, there would also be a raid from Luftwaffe 5, which was based in Norway. The goal for Luftwaffe 5 was to use its more northern location to make attacks against targets in the Midlands, which were expected to be at least partially stripped of their fighter protection due to actions in the south. The Germans believed that as the raids in the south escalated, fighter squadrons from 12 Group, which was the fighter command group in the Midlands, would be sent south, not just on a raid-by-raid basis, but also as a way of filling in for replacements as 11 Group suffered attrition. This was not a bad assumption, and in fact throughout the course of the battle, Dowding would constantly be under pressure from various RAF and political leaders to bring more and more fighter strength from 12 and 13 Group, which was in Scotland, down to the south to 11 Group. However, even if the movement of forces had been a part of Fighter Command's plans, the German assumptions built on their much inflated expectations of how many fighters they were shooting down, along with the belief that Fighter Command had far fewer aircraft than they actually had, resulted in a situation where the German estimates for how many fighters 12 Group would have to meet these Luftwaffe 5 raids were completely divorced from reality. The number of British fighters in the Midlands was critical because there was a problem due to Luftwaffe 5's position in Norway, and that was the fact that they had to travel too far to be escorted by Bf-109s. They could still be escorted by Bf-110s, which would fulfill its role as a long-range bombing escort, but over the previous weeks, there had already been several examples of the weaknesses of the 110s when faced by single-engine British fighters. To make matters worse, even though the Bf-110 had a much greater range than the single-engined German fighters, even that range was not enough with their normal load of fuel. This meant that for this bombing raid, they had additional fuel tanks fitted, about 1,000 liters, which were held in plywood-encased ventral fuel tanks. There were 2 problems with this fact. The first was that the fuel tanks, unlike some used on other aircraft later in the war, were not jettisonable, which meant that they would have an impact on the performance of the heavy fighters even after they were empty. They couldn't just get rid of them. The second problem was due to the additional weight of the fuel. The rear gunner had to be left behind, which removed the one advantage the heavy fighters had over their British rivals, their ability to fire backwards. But with the assumption that Fighter Command had already been knocked back by 2 days of fighting, the raid of 115 bombers split between HE-111s and Ju-88s, along with 34 Bf-110s as escort, would make their way over from Norway. They were discovered by British radar quite far out to sea, and the fighter squadrons were vectored in. 11 Spitfires were the first on the scene, quickly engaging and shooting down 7 110s. Then 18 Hurricanes arrived and went after the HE-111s, with 8 eventually being shot down. Most of the German aircraft abandoned their missions immediately, with the bombers just dropping their bombs wherever they were to gain speed and then turning around and going home. A few of the German bombers did continue overland, but all they did was damage a few homes in Sunderland. Due to the attention that was focused on the first raid, the second raid that was a bit behind had a better time of it, and the Ju-88s were able to drop their bombs over the airfield at Driffield, causing some damage and destroying some Whitley bombers. Even in this success, though, there were problems, because several Ju-88s and even more Bf-110s were lost. Overall, Luftwaffe 5's raid was considered a disaster, with close to 20% of the total attacking force being destroyed by the RAF. This was the final proof that German bombers were simply incapable of operating without the escort of 109s. The heavier 110s could not get the job done. This would limit Luftwaffe 5 to nighttime operations only moving forward, and in fact, August 15th would be their only daylight raid of the entire campaign. Even though August 15th had initially been considered a lost day due to weather expectations, it had turned out to actually be one of the largest days of the entire Battle of Britain, and it had been costly for both sides. The Southern Luftflotten 2 and 3 had flown almost 2,000 sorties during the day. They had hit many targets and had also lost 41 aircraft in total, with 18 of those being bombers. These victories had not come without a cost for the RAF, though, with 22 Hurricanes and Spitfires shot down, primarily by 109s. This was important because while the Luftwaffe was only marginally winning the war of attrition overall, the critical fighter versus fighter numbers were actually quite bad on the 15th for fighter command. Of the German aircraft destroyed on the 15th, only 4 of them were 109s, giving them a very nice victory-to-loss ratio, especially over the Spitfires and Hurricanes. The German estimates were of course much higher, though. They thought they were winning even harder, making their success appear to be much greater, with the German pilots reporting 70 RAF fighters destroyed on the 15th. Again, it was just 22. And this difference between 22 and 70 would feed into the growing disparity between actual fighter strength and German estimates of that strength. August 16th would see further operations of the same types as the Luftwaffe continued to focus on airfield attacks on the areas around London. Over 1,700 sorties were flown in these raids from both fighters and bombers, and they would target a dozen airfields, and while some of them were diverted due to cloud cover, they were still able to hit several of these airfields, which caused several British fighters to be destroyed on the ground. Due to mostly random chance, the number of fighters shot down in the air on both sides was actually higher on the 16th, with the RAF losing 19 Hurricanes and Spitfires and the Germans 15 109s, than it had been the day before, even though there had been more sorties the day before. When the number of German bombers and 110s were added to the numbers, they were very favorable for the RAF. They were still doing a good job if you looked at aircraft overall. The hope for the Luftwaffe was that the tempo of air raids during the 15th and 16th would wear down the RAF, but it was also wearing down their own pilots. Getting over 1,700 sorties over Britain in a single day often required some squadrons to make multiple trips, which wore down the pilots, especially in the all-important 109s. Some would begin their days flying over the channel while it was still dark, and they would not land from their final flight until it was almost dark again. This was destined to wear down the pilots involved, and there were limits to how long it could be continued. In recognition of this, August 17th would be considered a day of rest. There would be a few flights on the 17th, with the Luftwaffe flying some reconnaissance flights throughout the day and a few very small nighttime bombing raids. But all of these efforts were very small, as most of the Luftwaffe was given some rest. At the same time, the commanders and staff of the Luftwaffe units would spend the day reviewing the efforts of the previous days and planning once again for the future. When they evaluated what had already been done over the previous days, the reviews seemed quite positive, both from the first-hand accounts of the pilots and then reconnaissance flights that had been flown over some of the targets that had been hit by German bombers. With that in mind, the next days of bombing would be heavily focused on a relatively small number of RAF airfields, which were seen as ones most directly in opposition to the planned areas of the Sea Lion invasion. In Luftwaffe 2's areas, these would be Kinley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, and North Weald. All 4 of these airfields would be targeted by raids on the 18th, with 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Luftwaffe 3 would have the same type of targets, again focusing on airfields around Portsmouth due to their proximity to the planned invasion beaches. While the German staff officers were planning and many of the pilots were resting, on the British side, the 17th was a moment for preparations. One of the major items on the agenda was the continued repair of damage done to the various airfields used by Fighter Command, which had been damaged during the previous days of bombing. This was largely done manually with picks and shovels and by a combination of ground crews, airmen, and civilian workers. As there were not enough of any kind of mechanical earth mover to go around, most of it was done by hand. The most important items were not the craters that the bombs left, those just required some work, but instead the various unexploded bombs that still lay on the airfields. Some of these were purposefully unexploded, with the Germans having placed timers and triggers on them so that they would be delayed in their detonation. But there were also simply bombs that malfunctioned, but there was no way to tell the difference between the 2 groups that were all classified simply as unexploded bombs, or UXBs. After the Luftwaffe's day of rest, most of the drama on August 18th was focused on the raids by Luftwaffe 2, with their first raid targeting Kinley and Biggin Hill. Each of the sector station airfields would have their own raids that would attempt to arrive at roughly the same time, to prevent them from being focused on in succession. And instead of just one collection of aircraft, they would arrive in a series of smaller groups that were designed to complement one another. For example, against Kinley, the first group of aircraft would be 60 Bf-109s that were designed to knock back the Hurricanes and Spitfires to allow the following groups to have a free bombing run against their targets. The second group would be a dozen Ju-88s, which were given the task of targeting the hangars and buildings around Kinley. After this group would come 36 Dornier 17s, with most of them executing a medium-altitude bombing raid on the landing grounds, while a smaller number once again targeted buildings and hangars. Each of these groups of bombers would have their own fighter escort, although they would be positioned closer to the bombers than that first fighter sweep that went through before the bombers arrived. Due to the size of the raid, it was picked up quite early by the chain home system, and the alert went out for a 100-plus inbound raid, with 8 squadrons initially sent into the attack. 6 more fighter squadrons would also be put on high alert so that they could be airborne in 5 minutes if required. Due to distance, time, speed, and of course the presence of German fighters, little could be done to prevent the bombers from reaching the airfields, and bombs would fall on many of the targets. Several hangars and other buildings were hit by the successive raids of bombers, although one group of Dornier bombers would reach the target first, and the destruction they caused and the fires they would ignite would cause the Ju-88s to actually divert to West Malling instead, where they did a decent amount of damage because they thought that Kinley was already destroyed. Even if not every German bomber hit Kinley where it was supposed to, the facilities were still devastated. Out of the base's 4 hangars, 3 of them were heavily damaged. Almost more importantly, as the head of B sector, Kinley would not be fully back online for 2.5 days, putting additional strain on the other sectors to pick up the slack. 10 Hurricanes were also destroyed on the base. The success was not free though, and the Germans would lose several bombers during the raid, including 6 Dorniers from just one of the bomb groups. And while the raid at Kinley caused a lot of damage, the raids on Biggin Hill were a bit of a debacle. 3 separate waves of HE-111s would make the bomb run, and they would largely survive, but they ended up dropping most of their bombs off target, apparently in some woods to the east of the airfield, where the British didn't care if they dropped their bombs. The only damage reported after the raid was that there were a few craters on the airfield that were quickly filled in, and everything was back to being operational. While the German medium bombers were focused on more airfield raids, the Stukas were already moving in on other targets. Some groups would target a series of coastal command bases that were a risk to the invasion, while others would focus on the Royal Naval Air Service Ford base. A 4th group would target the Chain Home radar station at Poling. The Poling station was important because, due to various damage and raids of the previous days, it was the only one in the area that was still working at full capacity. Each of these raids would have a different result, but the greatest damage was done to the Royal Naval Air Service base at Ford, where the base's fuel dump caught fire due to the bombing. Various hangars and outbuildings were also destroyed, and several torpedo bombers were also destroyed by the bombs, about 12 of them in total. The damage was so severe that instead of trying to repair the base, the Royal Navy simply abandoned it, and in fact it would not be brought back into action for over a month, by which point it was turned into a night fighter squadron base. A total of 31 Stukas would target the Chain Home radar station specifically, dropping about 90 bombs in total. They did do some damage, but they did not take the station fully off the air. Fighter Command was not caught completely off guard by these raids, which were initially detected about 30 minutes before they started hitting their targets. They would, however, be able to catch up with the German dive bombers on their way back to France, and they would be able to do some serious damage. One example of this would be the Stukas that attacked the coastal command airfields at Thorney. Now, they did for the most part get their bombs off, but when they were fleeing the scene, 10 of them were shot down, and 2 more were damaged, to the point where they did not make it back to their bases. There were only 28 Stukas in total in the attack on Thorney, and with 12 of them not returning, almost half of the group no longer existed. Just another example of the dangers of unescorted raids by the aging Stukas. Later in the day on August 18th, there were also large raids planned, with the largest being the 109 bombers escorted by 140 fighters that would target the sector stations at Hornchurch and North Weald. However, the weather would intervene and the bombers would have to abandon their attempts at hitting the sector stations, and instead they dropped their bombs on a series of secondary targets, which were mainly Army and Royal Marine barracks buildings. They would do damage to these targets, but obviously they were less important to the overall Luftwaffe objectives than the RAF targets that were first on their list. Overall, on the 18th, the Luftwaffe flew about 660 sorties, roughly evenly split between bombing and fighter flights. In all of these sorties, they would lose 66 total aircraft, including 14 bombers, 19 Stukas, 15 Bf-110s, and 18 Bf-109s. Now, this was balanced against the loss of 34 Spitfires and Hurricanes in the air, and then 10 Hurricanes and 12 torpedo bombers on the ground, as well as, 20 aircraft of other types, usually lost on the ground to the German bombing raids. When all of this was added together, the RAF and the Royal Navy lost a combined 76 aircraft on August 18th, against the 66 that the Germans would lose. Losing more aircraft to the enemy was bad. It was not a good day. There was a reason that the 18th would be given the nickname the hardest day. But the ratio was still good enough for the British that they were continuing to prevent the Germans from accomplishing their objective of destroying the RAF, while retaining enough of their own strength to support the invasion. Taking stock on August 18th, the Luftwaffe's track record over the previous 5 days was something of a mixed bag. On one hand, they had hit many of the airfields, chain home stations, and other targets that they set out to bomb. However, the results had not been as catastrophic for the Royal Air Force and the overall structure of the British defenses as the Germans had hoped before the air campaign began. Damage had been caused, aircraft had been shot down and destroyed, but Fighter Command continued to exist. Next episode, we'll look at the German command conferences on August 19th, as the Germans needed to find adjustments to their plans, because it was not going to achieve its goals without major alterations.